Okay, so today we are discussing history of philosophy without any gaps. Please check out the links below. It's a study group. So we watched the first 3 episodes of the podcast, and we will be talking about it. So with us in the room, Nardalian Plebs, Rogeria Marx, and Graham Pong. And guys, please watch it live on their YouTube channels too. I'll provide the link below. Yeah, I pass the mic to you guys.
Yeah, Nerdalian, before we discussed about highlighting the potential benefits. So there are two groups of benefits, as we've seen, benefits for us as a group and individual benefits. Would you like to touch on that?
Yeah, so it was a while ago that we discussed the benefit. Actually, there's also potentially benefits for the audience, hopefully. So yeah, on an individual level, I've really benefited from studying intellectual history in general, and history of philosophy included in that. And I think one of the most valuable things about studying the history of thinkers or thought or ideas is not so much the ideas that one learns, although there are like real gems in between, but oftentimes if it's people who lived long ago, they've thought things that maybe today we don't agree with and we don't pick up, but it's still interesting to learn about it. And I think useful training in taking perspectives of people who had different worldviews to us. So people who lived in different cultures in different times, who spoke different languages, they had different religions, they had different political ideals, they had, they grew up differently, so the families were different and everything. So they thought very differently to us, and in some ways maybe similar to us, but studying something like a history of philosophy without any gaps gives us like a long list of people that we can get curious about. How did this person view the world? And not necessarily deciding whether we agree or disagree, even just to see if we can understand, because it can be a challenge just to understand, especially with these early thinkers. We have so little sources about them. It's almost impossible to really get into, I'd say probably is impossible to really get a sense of what they viewed the world like, because we have so little to go on. But as we develop further and there's more records, people have left entire books or entire bodies of work, then we can study, we can get a real sense of like different cultures and like a rich sense of trying to understand someone who thinks differently to us. And so individually, I think that's a very cool benefit. For the group, we can get practice extending that kind of perspective taking and understanding to each other. So we can, each one of us would at best just do an interpretation of the people we're studying, and there may be different interpretations, and so we can get to know each other and find out how we see the world differently. We're also raised in different cultures and in different countries, and some of us speak different languages, although we'll be speaking English. It's not all of our first languages. So yeah, we can extend that kind of curiosity about dead people who don't care whether we're curious about them to the people in the room with us who might really appreciate having been heard out and understood, or at least people making an attempt to understand. Understanding can often be difficult enough so that it takes multiple attempts. And yeah, then for the audience, I think maybe it could just be a break from people throwing insults at each other or describing each other as evil or destroying the world, and like having a political agenda or putting like anger and outrage about stuff, and just take a little break to see, here are interesting people who've said interesting things, even if maybe we don't agree with them, but can we try to work together to see if we can understand at least? So just a space where people are studying and learning for the sake of cultivating understanding is probably an all right thing to put out on the internet. I think it could benefit the audience. You also had a bunch of benefits that you added to the discussion we had last time. So
yeah, we had a brainstorming session offline without broadcasting, and so a bunch of ideas came to mind when we were talking about why we are doing this and what can come about out of this that is of value. I want to start by thanking you, Nerdalian, because you were the prime instigator in my perspective, because you challenged me to this for this very ambitious project and very interesting project. Basically, if there was already a fire of curiosity for philosophy in myself, it's even more intense right now because of this engaging and really interesting possibility. It's like we are on the verge of exploring a new country. It's unexplored territory for many of us in different aspects. And so potential benefits that I was thinking about involve if we are exposed to more ideas, especially if they are well thought ideas for the time period in which they arose, and have some sense to them, some rationality, and also some attachment to how the world works, some correspondence. It will help our minds to better distinguish from good ideas and bad ideas, or ideas that have no productive value for the improvement of the human condition. We can also get a sense of the genealogy of ideas or of human thought. There are many threads of brilliant thinkers and good ideas and doctrines that have passed down from times that to us are only enshrouded in myth, like these individuals that we'll be talking about. They lived in a colony that bordered a kingdom called Lydia, and this kingdom was ruled for 22 generations by supposed descendants of Hercules, who fathered a son with a slave girl and whatnot. And so there are these stories that have fallen into myth before the time of these individuals that we'll be discussing, that are difficult to ascertain whether they have a bearing on reality or not. But we must assume that we have these limitations. Information passed down from these generations has suffered distortion, and so we can also get a nice feel for that. To be succinct about how things have passed down from these guys, they have passed down from them to later Greeks, and then to Romans, and then to medieval scholars, and then to Enlightenment, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modern thinkers. And so each of them have either invented something or embellished or poisoned the information or tainted the well or whatnot. And so there is very likely an effect of deterioration of the original information. And even with that, so much has been lost. We have, without being exposed to history of philosophy and the history of ideas, we get a sense that we have been accumulating knowledge as human species over our history since writing exists. But that is very far from the truth. The very few pieces of information that have survived to us are very few indeed, and I think it will also give us this idea. Also, by studying human individuals in different time periods, in different contexts, helps us broaden our perspective on what human nature is and how it operates in different contexts. We will be, I think, surprised to see people in ancient times having some of the same problems that we have today, even though we might think these kinds of problems of our society are modern problems, and we are special for having them. But we will find very surprising things, I think. And so there is much more to be said about the benefits, but I think the benefits should talk for themselves as well as we progress through this project.
Yeah, I like that, and I like Right, but the benefit of getting a sense for the genealogy of ideas, and getting an appreciation for some of the ways in which knowledge has progressed cumulatively, and some of the ways in which it's been very frustratingly stagnant for thousands of years. And I think that's also humbling in some sense, that there are questions that the ancients have better answers than most people's grandmas have these days. And like that, I'm not sure many experts have any better answers to. And those are questions that sometimes people get into heated fights about. And I think having an appreciation that, well, that people have kind of been disagreeing on those topics since as early as recorded history, and it's still not settled. So maybe not expect to settle it in the Twitter flame war over a weekend. So that's not going to happen, probably. Yeah. Be interesting to hear from Kara and Graham too, who've been generous enough to join us. Why they thought it was a good idea for them to come and what they're looking forward to. Kara?
Oh, I think it's a nice kind of segue from everything I was doing on my channel into education about history and the way actually our minds formed somehow. What questions had been raised by the ancestors, what influenced us, what actually influenced our society as well. Like, it feels like getting perspective from the roots of our tree, let's say, humanity tree. I'm looking forward, like it's a discovery. It's something I haven't studied before. Focusing on whatever is going on feels like a good adventure. I'm looking forward to check it out. Graham?
Thanks. No, I appreciate the invitation to come, and there's a couple of advantages that I can add in there, and that is one of the things when I look at the past is I see one of the themes of history, which is that I've discerned, which is iteration with variation. Where it's like there's ways in which we're all human and all the same, all wrestle with the problems, and it's a chance to look at how other people have done so in the past, and if possible, learn from their mistakes and their errors so that we don't have to repeat them ourselves, which I always like to learn from somebody else so I don't have to do stupid things myself. The one I wanted to add is I think Adamson is a wonderful guy to go through this material with. And in some ways, we're basically going to be commenting on him as our basically, our guide through the material. And I've been through this before at least a couple of different times with most recent time with Vervaeke in the Meaning Crisis series. So looking forward to going it with you guys and also learning from all of you guys where I can learn from your mistakes because, man, I make enough of my own. I'd like to learn from some of yours so I don't repeat them. Thanks. Tagging out.
Yeah, shout out for Vervaeke.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding us that we will be making mistakes.
I mean,
I'm saying I will be.
Not only will we be making mistakes, we'll be making mistakes in public, recorded for posterity, so that they can learn from our mistakes too.
Yeah.
By the way, Peter Adamson is aware of this stream. He totally we tagged him and he put a like to it. So shout out if you're watching. It adds a lot to the pressure. You can see it. Yeah, and by the way, guys, if you make mistakes, please correct us. It's welcome.
Yeah.
It's a discovery process that we do. It's not who is the rightest of the right, but it's let's find out what it is. Let's just speculate. Yeah.
If I may, since we're mentioning modesty, and there's a few ideas from ancient Greece as well related to this, which are really interesting. when the poets like Hesiod or Homer started their poems, they would start by asking permission from the muses and inspiration. So they are kind of assuming that the excellence is not within them, that they need to channel it through them. And so they need to appeal to a higher power to be able to put into writing things of excellence, texts of excellence. And there's also this idea conveyed in many histories of Greek mythology that is tales, cautionary tales, where human hubris leads to tragedy. And so drawing inspiration from these ancient, potentially wise as we cannot be right now human beings, we must assume our limitations, have self-awareness of them. By no means I am a professional philosopher, as people like Peter Adamson are. And so we approach this content, and I think, as I've correct me if I'm wrong, you guys aren't either, at least specifically in the field of philosophy. And so we are approaching this kind of material with a fresh look as well, which comes with its limitations, but also comes with its benefits. We will be looking at this with the eyes of a child that is eager and curious to learn from these individuals that we are very lucky to have fragments and pieces of information, even if indirectly, about them.
I wanted to add a little bit to the muses. So I entertained this idea to see this particular podcast today through the three muses, Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. And my muse, the one who is speaking to me the most, is Pathos. I actually, by the end of the episode, I would like to know who are your muses.
I have no idea.
I bet it's Ethos.
Okay, so what's next?
So we agreed to prepare at least listen and or read through the first three episodes on the podcast. They correspond to the first three chapters in volume 1 of the transcribed books. And together they cover, on the podcast, Peter Adamson introduces the podcast and the goal of the podcast and what it's going to be like in the first episode. And then he continues in that episode to talk about Thales, and in the second episode, he talks about Anaximander and Anaximenes. And in the third episode, he talks about Xenophanes. I've been a little curious, and I wanted to ask you guys, we've all studied the material, or at least viewed or listened to the material. I'm not sure the best thing to do would be to try to verbatim summarize the material for the audience. So if this was an offline study group, that's not what we would be doing. So I guess there are some interesting questions that we might discuss about the material. So one question, like personal questions, like are there any of those people who seem like interesting people that we seem admirable, or maybe not the opposite of admirable in certain ways that we can find? Are there any ideas that seem to us particularly interesting? Are there some thoughts that we struggle to understand and not make sense of that others may help us? And if there's something that we find particularly interesting, maybe it's a good idea to get some practice to try to summarize that, try to articulate that. There's a benefit for remembering material to at least try to summarize and explain a small part of it. So those are a couple of things that we might be doing when we do this study group discussion of the material.
So there are a few possibilities here to kickstart this. We can make a bridge between the mythical and the philosophical by drawing inspiration also from other sources that touch the same points as Peter Adamson, but flesh it out a little bit more. So I have an excerpt here from Carl Sagan's Cosmos that I can share it in two ways. It doesn't need to be here read. It can also be in the video description or whatnot. But it's I'll let you tell me what you think. But I could do that reading if it's appropriate, and also then show the context that we have here in visual aids as well.
Yeah, I think we'll have time for that, and I think probably have time for both the reading and have space to put it in the description. Descriptions can be edited very easily.
Okay, so I'll do the reading, which I think will give us some raw material for reactions and whatnot, and then we can bridge to the philosophers. Okay, so this is from Carl Sagan's Cosmos, Chapter 7, The Backbone of Night. There was a god or goddess for every human concern. Gods ran nature. Nothing could happen without their direct intervention. If they were happy, there was plenty of food, and humans were happy. But if something displeased the gods, and sometimes it took very little, the consequences were awesome. Droughts, storms, wars, earthquakes, volcanoes, epidemics. The gods had to be propitiated. And a vast industry of priests and oracles arose to make the gods less angry. But because the gods were capricious, you could not be sure what they would do. Nature was a mystery. It was hard to understand the world. The Greek religion explained that diffuse band of light in the sky as the milk of Hera, the goddess, squirted from her breast across the heavens, a legend that is the origin of the phrase Westerners still use, the Milky Way. Perhaps it originally represented the important insight that the sky nurtures the earth. If so, that meaning seems to have been forgotten millennia ago. In ancient Greece, in the time of Homer, where there were gods of the sky and the earth, the thunderstorm, the oceans and the underworld, fire and time and love and war, where every tree and meadow had its dryad and maenad, which are lesser divine beings. For thousands of years, humans were oppressed, as some of us still are, by the notion that the universe is a marionette whose strings are pulled by a god or gods, unseen and inscrutable. Then, 2,500 years ago, there was a glorious awakening in Ionia, the place where we will be looking. On Samos and other nearby Greek colonies that grew up among the islands and inlets of the busy eastern Aegean Sea, current-day Western Turkey, suddenly there were people who believed that everything was made of atoms, that human beings and other animals had sprung from simpler forms, that diseases were not caused by demons or gods, that the earth was only a planet going around the sun, and that the stars were very far away. This revolution made cosmos out of chaos. The universe is knowable, the ancient Ionians argued, because it exhibits an internal order. There are regularities in nature that permit its secrets to be uncovered. Nature is not entirely unpredictable. There are rules even she must obey. This ordered and admirable character of the universe was called cosmos.
Yeah, thanks. That was great.
Yeah, we are atoms that contemplate other atoms. It's beautiful.
We are star stuff.
Stardust.
Experiencing. Yeah.
Yep. I was going to add to that one. One of the aspects that I've been picking up from Adamson is the emphasis on the idea of writing and the idea that this is, I always say that, that's one of the ways that I know that I can process better is when I can write it down and make it explicit like that. And in some ways, what we're looking at is, humanity wrestling with how to write their ideas down as opposed to just speak them and communicate them that way. and it's almost like this is humanity learning how to think as more as a group level. Tag.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that went on in there. I'm kind of tempted to bring up some slides that Rogerio made to make a point that adds to the writing. I think I'll do that. So from slide 1. So this is the part of the world where the people lived that we were talking about. The right-hand side of the map, on the coast side, that's Ionia. It's the west of Turkey. And the cities that Rogerio marked for us are here. And there are some maps that show the domain of the Greeks spread much further. But something very noticeable about the Greek domain was there was mostly coastal cities. And something that's very interesting about a lot of the early thinkers that Adamson discusses is that a lot of them were well-traveled. So they would have gone visited several of those cities. And yeah, the Greeks made quite a bit of money with overseas trade. And a lot of that was, some of the money came from sheep wool, like Miletus got rich on sheep. There's a story about Thales getting really rich because he was able to predict a good season, a good olive season. And he cornered the olive prices market and got really rich that way. And so I think this, some of the obsession with trying to understand nature to the point of being able to predict nature, some of it was just purely practical concerns, economic concerns. Like almost all of them had a bunch to say about the stars or the heavens. And for people navigating at sea, the stars are the only way you have to navigate. And if you get lost at sea, you could die at sea quite easily. So it's pretty critical to know the stars very well. So navigating at sea and navigating by the stars, really important, both economically and militarily. And so, yeah, it is interesting that these sort of natural philosophers, early natural philosophers, may have discovered that, like, sort of resorting to the anger of the gods or the caprices of the gods to describe why it rains a lot, or the movements in the skies, not practically useful as more rational means of explaining those things. So maybe grasping at more at explanations that are better at predicting for quite practical reasons. That's speculation on my part, I don't know. But
yeah, if I may, to complement your story about the Thales and the olive presses, it seems that people were criticizing Thales for his philosophical lifestyle. They were saying, what good is philosophy if you are not rich, you are not wealthy? And he basically addressed that argument, that concern, by employing sound reasoning to predict the climate and also the correspondence with crop yields. And probably he drew from either Egyptian or Babylonian wisdom on the climate. So this information, this wisdom, doesn't appear in the vacuum. It came from somewhere, neighbors that were much more ancient than the Greek civilization, namely Babylon and Egypt. And when I say ancient, I say several millennia before. And so he used this information to become rich and destroy utterly this concept that a philosopher is rich by the circumstances, and instead he demonstrated that a philosopher is, when they are not rich, it's just because they are focusing on other things than becoming wealthy monetarily or materially.
I was going to say, you hit on one of the things I extracted from Adamson, and that I see as his key definition of philosophy, which is the use of because. And it was the linkage of argument and the use of explaining things with because, as opposed to just any other explanation, like, the gods. And it's having to see how valid those becauses were is pretty much what I see Adamson as focusing on, the story of philosophy. Tagging.
I think it's a good time now to talk about how Thales conceived of the origin of the cosmos, or what the cosmos looked like for him, because it's really interesting what he left out, especially.
Continue.
Okay.
I actually
Go
just
ahead,
want to interject a joke a little bit here.
Yeah, go.
It's the fact that when he was conceiving what the cosmos is looking like and contemplating the stars and navigation and everything, was looking up, fell down the well, wet himself, and decided, well, water is really important. That's my take.
Yeah. Also, as Nerdalium really pointed out very well, all these cities are coastal cities, and for good reason. For economic reasons, trade was really hot in the Aegean Sea at that time period. Ships going from one place to another continuously, taking wool and dyes and olives and etc. etc. So many timber, so many materials shipped from one place to the other. That of course this created the necessity for excellence in shipmanship, navigation, agriculture as well. As we've seen, it is really important to know what the sky is doing, and how to predict things related to the sky, not just the stars and celestial objects, but the climate, to have better grasp on predictability, which is essential for a good business. Also, since I mentioned the cosmology thing, Thales, very roughly, and I'm really paraphrasing very roughly here, Adamson's words and the fragments and whatnot. Very roughly, Thales conceived of the cosmos as the Earth floating upon water, which is not entirely surprising, considering he was living surrounded by sea most of the time. His perspective as almost an islander, or at least a person living in bays or these peninsulas. And so he conceived of the cosmos having originated roughly from water, and it condensed in a more solid form that floats upon water, which is more or less similar to the Babylonian myth of creation in some respects, but with a very important distinction, which is Thales' cosmology left out any gods whatsoever. He didn't mention any divine beings in his cosmology, which is highly contrasting to, for instance, Hesiod, which was the kind of the source of cosmology at the time, and he made a humongous family tree with hundreds of divine beings to explain stuff, everything.
Yeah, so that brings me to like an interesting difference of focus, where Homer in his Iliad and Odyssey and Hesiod tried to explain the world by explaining a family of gods, in some ways seems to have done a better job of describing humanity and a worse job of describing the heavens and the climate and the stars and the origin of physical things. So there's almost a tension in that, like describing the reasons wars start or the reasons spouses fall out with each other, or family dynamics. Like reading the stories written by poets and shared by bards, and get some like insight into at least a working of a part of the cosmos that some of these guys who were kind of obsessed with the stars and with nature didn't necessarily have a lot to say about. At least these first three didn't seem to have a lot to say about. But Thales among them had an interesting connection between the two, where he said, there are gods in everything. And they're not necessarily these daddy and mommy gods or sister gods or tempters or jesters or sort of archetypal roles that humans play in in relationships. Rather, more abstractly, they're just those things that cause movement. And in some sense, like people's passions, people's angers, and being tempted and all that stuff do move people. They move human affairs. They don't necessarily move the rains or the suns or the droughts or whatever. But so Thales used the example of both amber and magnets to say, like, they can move physical things, and the source of movements are souls or gods, and therefore, since even something that is considered dead can move stuff, like maybe the source of movement is in everything all over. And so there may be a little link between like the kind of gods that move magnets or that move iron through magnets and the kind of gods that move nations into war are different kinds of gods, and maybe we need different stories to understand what's going on. But at a very abstract level, they're the source of movement, and I think that's it sort of presages a little bit Aristotle's doctrine of a prime mover as the origin of it's like one conception of God. And yeah, something that was helpful for me in studying the history of philosophy was just the great diversity with which things like souls and gods are even conceived of, like what they might be, what kinds of things they might be. When I was younger, before I got into history of philosophy, I was a little troubled by the question, does God exist or does God not exist? And that question gets a whole lot more complicated when you realize there are like 1,000 different definitions for what God even is, and the interpretation of what the question even means, like turns on what you mean God even is. And similarly, for do humans have souls? Do they have free will? That kind of thing. Kind of depends what you mean. Is there something that do humans have some kind of attribute that allows them to initiate movement? Yes, they do. So if your definition of soul is that which allows things to initiate movement, then humans have souls. If by soul you mean something completely different, like this thing that this disembodied personality that survives death, maybe your answer would be different to whether humans have souls or not. But yeah, that links back to this thing I said earlier, where we get a lot of practice getting a diversity of ways of conceiving the world. And some of these ways are quite dear to us, like our own souls and the gods. And personally, I don't have so much practical use for predicting rains and navigating by stars or whatever. So that stuff is less interesting to me, whereas matters regarding the soul and the dynamics of human affairs are more interesting to me. But nonetheless, it's even those things where it's less interesting, I think we have a chance to evaluate arguments and get practice at critical thinking, and still also practice at perspective taking. Like, what if we started with different assumptions? What is there to say for a certain theory, even if it's not necessarily the most interesting theory?
No, all good points, Nerdalian. And one of the things that complicates things a little bit further is when the philosophers start questioning what the meaning of exist is, because now you've slid everything lower. And one of the aspects of myth that I appreciate is it's basically a different way to encode information. And it's a way of encoding that the ancients had an understanding of, that we are only trying to recover and get there. And in a lot of ways, what you were talking about with magnets and amber, we've kind of come full circle, where we've taken from the abstract gods, the abstract gods that we couldn't, have anything to do with, starting with the philosophy, and we're ending up with abstract, electromagnetic force that we're dealing with. And it's almost like it's a full circle sort of thing. Pagan.
If I may, to bring my scientific background or scientific training as something to complement where Thales was going for, or where he was at with this thing about amber having electrostatic characteristics, and also magnets obviously generating magnetic fields as we know today. And he was interpreting these things in the same vein as the word, the ancient Greek word psyche, which to me means something capable of intrinsic behavior. and so of course it would apply to humans, it would apply to magnets and any object that has static electricity. And it's really intriguing that he associated soul to material objects that had electricity, because nowadays our studies of the field of neurophysiology, we know that cogitation or cognition in our minds correlates with electrical activity, mostly electrical activity, within and between neurons firing, basically. And so it's really interesting that without any extensions, or at least we believe without any extensions to his senses, he was already kind of getting a true belief, roughly, regarding where our minds come from and correlating it with electricity. We could also, since doing the reading, introductory reading, we could also do a reading of Thales. Either one of us or myself.
Yeah, if there's something specific you want to read, like by Thales himself, his excerpts are quite short, I believe.
Yeah. Well, actually, it is supposedly from Thales, but it's filtered to us through Aristotle. And so we must take it with a grain of salt, because as Peter Adamson pointed very nicely, Aristotle was biased. He had the tendency to reinterpret these predecessors, intellectual predecessors of his, as kind of grasping towards the sublime ideas that Aristotle arrived at. And so here goes. Others say, he's referring to Thales, that the earth rests on water. This indeed is the oldest theory that has been preserved, and is attributed to Thales of Miletus. It was supposed to stay still because it floated like wood and other similar material. He used physis, which is material, which are so constituted as to rest upon water, but not upon air, as if the same account had not been given of the water, which carries the earth, as of the earth itself. And so it roughly gives us the worldview, the cosmic worldview of Thales.
No, excellent points. The other one is his Thales water also echoes the waters of the deep in the Bible, and also the Hindu creation myth with where the lotus blossom opening on the waters is what creation was as well. Taggin.
Yeah, one way in which people summarize Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes is by giving each of them credit for assigning something else as the source of all being. And so some people interpret Thales as meaning that everything is made from water. And I think Anaximander is credited with saying everything comes from a boundless infinite. And Anaximenes, that everything comes from air, if I'm remembering correctly. And from all of those, like the most interesting thing is this like really abstract notion of infinity as a source of being to me. And there's something beautiful about that. I don't know like even how to evaluate whether it's true or false, but what do you guys think about this, even the motivation to understand like the origin of all things? I know that's something Carl Sagan shares, and a lot of people share.
Yeah,
personally, like we're not studying the history of philosophy really at the history. We're just studying it at the like where we have records from, just not the very beginning. And I'm not so tempted in speculating the actual origin of like the first philosopher. But it's like seems for a lot of people, they not only want to go back to the origins of the first human, but like the origins of everything, even if that means speculating And I'm interested about that. Like, what's the draw of speculating about the ultimate origin of everything?
I can speculate about it a little bit, because it seems that there were 8th or 9th century BC thinkers in the borders, close to the Ganges River, the Indus Valley, that were doing mathematics, that were potentially thinking about things composed of atoms. There are ancient texts called the Upanishads that range from everything of using gods to explain moral values, or at least to serve as a didactic mean to understand or reinforce the importance of morality. But there are also texts by people that were had a very atheistic worldview, that talked about the elements, atoms, etc. Having said that, there is scant evidence of communication between peoples, especially from the distance of Western Turkey, Western current-day Turkey, and the Indian subcontinent. It's very difficult to ascertain what kind of ideas traversed this distance, but it seems that there was commerce even through ancient times between these different kingdoms. And so with goods, who knows what kind of ideas might have traversed. And also we typically have this idea that people might have traveled in those times of Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, but they probably didn't travel far. Thales at most went to Egypt and Babylon, learned a bunch of math there and cosmic worldviews and other bits and pieces of wisdom, but probably that's where things ended up, and he drew from those nearby ancient neighbors. And so there's a lot to speculate here, but it's really interesting that, for instance, one of the individuals that we will talk about in future, Pythagoras, we attribute to him the Pythagorean theorem, but there is evidence of this knowledge of the sum of the sides, the square of the sum of the sides of a right triangle, corresponding to the square of the diagonal, being known much ancient, much earlier than Pythagoras' time in ancient Babylon and also in India. There's evidence of this, and so we must not go into the tempting tendency of thinking that everything started in the West and everything is thanks to Western thinkers. There has been likely a cross-pollination across cultures from East to West.
No, I'd like to... go ahead, Ndali.
I'll give you a chance in a second. I just wanted to say Peter Adamson does cover the history of Indian philosophy, so we'll get to that soon. I'm really excited to study that history. I've never studied the history of Indian philosophy particularly, so really looking forward to that. Sorry, Gam, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's good. What I was going to say is that's one of the areas that I've kind of been pointed towards in my research recently, is the role of like the Persian Empire in the spreading of disease, and not disease, but knowledge, and the founding of philosophy in the West. And they are a natural conduit between India and Greece, because they're basically owned everything in between the two. And they had again, with all of those empires, had such a fabulous communication network. They built a lot of the original road systems before Rome. And you know for certain that Pythagoras spent 10 or 15 years in Babylon. He went to Egypt and went over there for 10 or 15 years before going back and teaching his stuff there. So you know for certain that he would have picked up God knows how much information from, everything that they had in Babylon, all the ancients to that point. And what the other one I wanted to say about the search for, the unity of things, to bring in one of the more recent philosophers is Robert Nozick with his final book, Invariances, where he basically ties, it's the unified, us in the same reality. That's how we can communicate. And what we're communicating are our invariances in our own perceptions of the world. We're able to communicate because both of us have attributed the same word to, say, blue or square. And it's those invariances is what we're dealing with between each other. And that's somewhat of that smallest piece is where the ancient philosophers were, what's the smallest Lego piece that we can build everything out of? And tagging out on that.
I think it could be maybe worthwhile to show our three first subjects for today in the visual aid, so we can as well do a nice bridge between them. So we've been talking about Thales mostly, with some references to later guys like Pythagoras. We'll get to him in a more focused discussion eventually. Hoping that things continue well. So by looking at this slide, we can clearly see that Thales was likely not very much older than the other two guys. They were possibly contemporaries. They were possibly, they knew each other possibly. They might have learned from each other directly or indirectly. There is this tendency by Aristotle to conceive of them as master, then student, and then student of the student. But it's not a clear cut. It's not very certain that there was this relationship, especially considering Thales talked about quite different things than Anaximander, and also focused on a different worldview than Anaximander, and so forth. Maybe Anaximander and Anaximenes, even with the names being really, really close, their ideas were also quite close as well. Because, as you've mentioned, Nerdalem, Anaximander conceived of a worldview in which material of the cosmos originated out of the endless or boundless void. And Anaximenes reinterpreted this void as air, in a sense.
Yeah, thanks for that. Relating to like the relation to these guys and maybe to like the possibility of communication, one of the things I speculated is I vaguely recall reading somewhere, I think I'm gonna remove the slides, vaguely recall reading somewhere that quite a common ritual in nomadic tribes whenever bordering tribes encounter each other is to start, before negotiating trades and doing all that, by recounting family trees and the theory that I read to explain that was to remind each other that like they're of the same family, even though they may struggle to understand each other because they're speaking nicely different dialects. I try to find like a common ancestor so that then there's a bit of comfort that they're dealing with family and close ones. And I was wondering if for at least some people, this desire to find the ultimate origin of everything and to tell a story that covers everything, as this is where everything comes from, is to almost say we're all born of the same story. We all have the same ultimate mother and father, so we're all kind of family. So we should treat each other well, like as family might be expected to, although in practice don't always. Yeah, it's a thought I've entertained. I'm not sure if I believe it.
Sure. We are blessed nowadays due to our much more accurate, I believe, comprehension of the workings of the cosmos, thanks to our methods of science and aids to our senses in the form of technology, microscopes, telescopes, mass spectrometers, etc. So, and also particle colliders, etc. Fortunately, we have a better grasp than these individuals could ever have hoped for regarding the stuff of the cosmos. Roughly speaking, the cosmology we know about that connects to us as human beings is roughly everything started from the Big Bang with hydrogen. Heavier elements arose due to the lives of stars, from smaller stars to bigger stars. Also, there have been really weird stars, very concentrated stars that resemble atomic nuclei of the size of the island of Manhattan. They are called neutron stars. Within them, the material of atoms is so tightly packed, it assumes forms more similar to spaghetti and lasagna of atoms and spaghetti of atoms. And when two neutron stars collide, they spread out their guts, which would result in the heaviest atoms possible by nature. And so all these interactions created this wide array of elements that we are blessed to that exist today, because they make us up. They are our makeup, and every single one of us has these materials in our bones, in our muscles, coursing through our blood, making our brains. And so this is an idea that has no mysticism, that can be revised. It is being revised as we speak by bold men and women, very curious individuals that are working, some of them tirelessly, more than common people do their 9-to-5s, because the cosmos never stops working, and they're on the situation in a continuum around the clock, doing shifts. And so, thanks to this tireless work that has started, who knows when, in maybe in the first civilizations from the Indus Valley or China or whatnot, where people started making their rudimentary settlements because they found out that agriculture is worthwhile, and then figured out to make agriculture, it would be really nice to do trades, to do commerce, and also to figure out crop yields and what the sky is doing relates to crop yields and whatnot. And so all this necessity made people want to know about themselves and the cosmos as well, and things are related. We are not just within the cosmos is within us. And so this is a summary of the summaries of part of why we are here, not just in this live stream, but why we are here in general, and an appreciation for the fundamentals, the essentials that connect us all, instead of just degenerating to focus on surface and arbitrary qualifications of us as individuals that might seduce us into conflict.
Yeah, that's really cool. Are we going to say anything about Xenophanes before we leave? Or just Graham, Cara, do you have anything you wanted to add about Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes?
Well, I like their way of viewing the world and the creation itself. So just to compare, Thales, so the universe is floating on water. Anaximenes thought it's a cylinder. And of course, Anaximander thought it's a disc floating in the air.
A frisbee.
And yeah, like a frisbee, exactly. And so I was curious to compare those two. It's this joke of tic-tac-toe. Which element is the Earth created by? Is it water? Is it air? And also the opposition and unity. That idea that that this exists simultaneously. It's like this concept of both opposition and unity being this dance ever kind of present. It's something that makes us move. That movement is the friction between opposition and unity. That is two. Yeah, I don't want to butcher the names. So it's pronounced differently in when you put it in the actual Greek translator, how the names are pronounced and the way we pronounce, and it cringes me out.
Do you want to try?
Okay, Anaximander. Anaximenes. Anaximenes.
Sounds great.
Anaximenes, actually, like that's the Greek pronunciation, but we would like to pronounce it
Yeah.
Anaximenes.
Maybe before we touch on Xenophanes, we could read one quote from either Anaximander and Anaximenes, which touch on one of your points, Kara. So from Anaximander, we have things come to be and are destroyed according to necessity, for they mete out penalty and retribution to one another for injustice according to the ordering of time. Anaximander. So this is one of the very first fragments that we are more or less certain that was something that the individual actually said or wrote. And so this is for the scholars like Peter Adamson. I could even feel it in his voice, like a blessing from fate. And then
And
go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, no, I wanted to comment before we move on to that one with Anaximander, because he's actually one of my favorite philosophers of all time. And it's because of his use of apeiron and the boundless infinity, because one of the things that I find fascinating, I've kind of done a comparative approach and, East and West sort of thing. And what I find fascinating is the idea that he and Lao Tzu were contemporaries. And because very much what that Anaximander quote is almost identical to how Lao Tzu described the Tao, everything emerging from it and then returning back to it. And it's like both of them were putting into words for the first time the same concepts, one from the East, one from the West. And I find that sort of bridge, and when you again boiling it down to the invariances, they're dealing with the same sort of concept there. And I just find that fascinating between the two of them. And with Anaximander, he was the first one who did the map of the earth, and he was just right about so much stuff, almost you can't explain why he was so right, because you can't have reasons behind it. It's that bridge into putting things into words where it's clear that the ancients had understandings that weren't written and weren't put into words, that they were just barely, trying to force it in there. And it's like almost a drip as opposed to what they actually knew, that we actually received. Tagging out on that.
You want to comment, Nerdalium or Kara, on what we just read and Peter Graham's words?
Yeah, so for me, what stood out about the excerpt you read is this extending the metaphor of human justice and conflict to account for like the rising of natural things is interesting to me. Like, it suggests that this is a person for who justice was really important, and perhaps I'm trying to relate to these people, maybe got really angry at things that they perceived of as unfair. Like if justice is important enough to be brought into account as the origin of all things, or like conflict and justice, I imagine this is a person who might have got really upset by unfairness and injustices, and may have gotten into fights with people they disagreed about injustices. So perceived injustices and not injustices. To me, that's relatable. I get upset when I perceive things as unfair quite easily.
Yeah, it's like we have an perhaps inborn sense of justice or injustice.
At least, maybe most people do. I don't know if everyone has that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just when I'm angry, but sometimes it seems like other people don't necessarily share that.
I also really liked Graham's comments. It's so tempting to pair Lao Tzu and Anaximander on this, because it's really tempting to think maybe Anaximander got news from the East about this thing of the Tao, of there being these opposites, that from them equilibrium emerges, harmony emerges, and maybe this connects to Anaximander's intuition or at least inspiration to do a metaphor involving justice and the machinations of the cosmos, which is so nice because nowadays we talk about natural laws of physics.
Exactly. And it's I almost see it as, even without any contact between them, it's like two scientists looking down a microscope. These are two thinkers that are just basically peering into, reality and the consciousness, and they're basically seeing the same things and putting it into words that their cultural context makes sense, as opposed to necessarily that one communicated with the other and had priority, which, again, if anything, it looks like Anaximander was actually the older of the two.
Yeah, exactly. So some of the communications, if at all, might have also been the other way around, of course, from west to east as well. But this is supposing that they happened at all, because it is also entirely possible that different brilliant thinkers separated by many miles or kilometers of land or sea might arrive at the same kind or similar brilliant ideas that have a rough correlation to how the cosmos really works, or the universe.
Yeah, because they're both living in the same universe, so they're observing the same thing. So it makes sense that they would come to the same sort of logical conclusions. Kagan.
We can also read from another passage from Anaximander, which I found really striking. And Carl Sagan was so tempted to say it was a foreshadowing of the theory of evolution that I cannot resist not reading it. So he said that the first living creations were born in moisture, enclosed in thorny barks, and that as their age increased, they came forth on to the drier part, land. And when the bark had broken off, they lived a different kind of life for a short time. So this is from Aetius' philosophic opinion. So of course it's a second-hand account, but really interesting nonetheless, because it gives an idea of transformation, of adaptation of life to different environments, even though it is clearly lacking the idea of diversity among individuals and the selection process, be it natural or artificial selection, that really exists and is described in current days scientific theories.
I had not heard that one. That one reminds me that he sounds like he's almost describing amphibians, where the same, starts their larval stage in the water and then goes up onto the land. And interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, these thorny barks could be what he was seeing in some animals, like maybe if he visited Egypt, the Nile crocodiles as well. They lay their eggs and then they also spend time on land. And so who knows? Let's move on to Anaximenes, or you could either comment on what we just said.
No, I would say like both. First thing I thought of was like frogs, but crocodiles actually make a bit of sense too, with the bark and everything.
Yeah.
Crocodiles have backs that look a bit like tree bark.
I want to water a little bit your conversation by mentioning the crowd engagement. Thank you, Peter and Wolfie, for being here. It's and live commenting. Thanks. Next time I will be able to display your comments.
Yeah, I could show a couple right now. I like one by Wolfie about how the night sky can be really good.
There you go.
Awesome.
Yeah, just a reminder that light pollution in cities and busy areas give us a very different view than what the ancients might have had if they had less light pollution. It's really a lot more awesome without the light pollution. A cool reminder. Introvert also had a couple of good comments. You want to comment on Wolfie's first before I move on?
Sure. It's really truly the backbone of night, of Nyx, as the Greeks called her, and as Carl Sagan was mentioning.
Yeah, Introvert had this nice little gem that he shared.
Yeah. Van Gogh's Starry Night comes to mind when atoms swim in the sky, swirling it.
Yeah. Contemplating their own existence, a reminder that we are some of those atoms.
This reminded me of a kind of a meme, which is the meme of the honey badger. Honey badger doesn't care. It's a video meme that is really, really funny because he just does what he wants to do, and he has no care in the world. He never shows any fear or regret. He just slays whatever prey he finds, and if a lion messes with him, he just messes with the lion back. If he wants honey, he just goes and takes it from the bees, even if he's stung 1 million times. He doesn't care. If he wants to eat a snake, he eats a snake, and if the snake bites him, what's the problem? He'll just go into a coma and wake a little bit later and just go on with his life. And so atoms go even one step further. Atoms really don't care. Absolutely. They completely in the flow, in the Tao.
In the Tao, the seed doesn't try to grow, it just grows. That's it.
Yeah.
Another comment from Wolfie. We wrestle with the very magic. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, guys, we really appreciate all of you in comments, watching live, participating in a study group.
Yeah, that's cool. Shall we do the Anaximenes reading and then maybe finish up with quick talking about Xenophanes? He said some interesting things I'm pretty keen to talk about, actually.
Yeah, let's. So we had. So Anaximenes was also from Miletus, as we've seen for these three guys. They were all from the same city, roughly, even though they traveled. He said human souls were made of pneuma, air. The Greek word for air is pneuma, which made sense because air was his favorite, and when a being stopped breathing, they died. This was Peter Adamson's words. Also, Anaximenes had the idea that there are gods, but these gods came from air. So air is super important and super likable for Anaximenes. He had his head in the air at many instances, probably. There's also, he said that the earth we live on is shaped not like the drum, but like a disc, as Kara pointed out. It forms by the aforementioned process of thickening air and then rides on the air that is still in its original state. So these people probably saw the water cycle in all its glory from their islands and peninsulas and bays. They saw condensation forming endlessly. But perhaps it was their inspiration from the nature they were experiencing. And that's all I have from Anaximenes of Miletus.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that it may have been their observation of the water cycle that led to that. I haven't thought of that. That makes a bit of sense.
They just really quickly, they might have seen condensation forming in their homes and molds growing where the water was, and so it seemed like something that could be originating from water.
And that's what I was going to go with. It seems like, when you're talking the water cycle with the air, you're echoing back to Thales with his water. And one of the aspects of Thales, where he came up with it for water, is you see all three states of water. It's one of the few things that we see both in a gas, liquid, and solid state. And I also kind of see where Anaximenes is, if you sort of look at aperion condensing and that being air, you kind of have a consistency between Anaximander and Anaximenes, and they're just using a different word to describe the same sort of concept. And Anaximenes is just a little more concrete, coming from the air side. Going to tag on that.
Yeah, they form a really nice philosophical, intellectual triangle, commenting on water, the void, and air. And so we have a really hint, a good hint here of the machinations of how water behaves in the cosmos, and it leads us to speculate on this. Of course, it's speculation. We have no idea what was in their minds. We have so scant evidence.
Yeah, and that's a really cool segue to Xenophanes, who basically made the same point that everything anyone has to say about the gods is also just speculation, because we don't exactly have great evidence for what the gods are like. Although a little funny to me is his conception that gods should be morally excellent, and that because of the vicious and actions attributed to the gods in some of the epic poems that were famous, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and stuff, like those couldn't possibly be true because the gods couldn't be so immoral. The gods have to be moral, which is an interesting, different way of conceiving of gods than even Thales. So, like beyond just there being cross-cultural differences, there's also differences within cultures and how different people view the world differently. And so for Xenophanes, the gods were considered as, or even the god was considered as the ultimate moral good, which is a very different conception of what the type of thing a god even is than the conception that sort of thing that causes things to move, like the origin of movement. Is the origin of movement may be immoral, because the movement itself may be quite immoral. Like people do all kinds of immoral things, and you may ask what caused people to do the immoral things, and the causes of those, if that's like the causes of all kinds of movement are what you think of as gods, then yeah, the gods can be immoral. But if you think of gods as like the ultimate moral exemplars, then it doesn't make sense to attribute to the gods these immoral actions. So you can have a bit of a conflict. And in order to get clear about some things, he made a very important distinction that seems super basic, but it's nice to have an early example of someone making an important philosophical distinction, the distinction between beliefs about the gods and the truths about the gods. And while we have beliefs and and even like beliefs about the gods and knowledge of truth about the gods, and so while we may make arguments and look at evidence to come at beliefs, ultimately we don't necessarily have knowledge, and we don't know if it's true, that what we believe is true. I think those are really interesting contributions to philosophy in general.
Yeah,
I think
I see.
he was I really liked his skepticism about the nature of gods being like all relatable to humans. Let's say he resented the idea that gods are like this Jersey Shore type of characters that go into fights, adultery, and all of that, so that people can be, well, we can look up to those, so it kind of excuses our behavior, right? Like we can be like Zeus, who can go and do all of those, or Hera, let's say, and embody these family values. And he is like, well, why do you guys just use gods as an excuse to do that? Like, how about you create a different way, like, let's say not many but ideal, and the ideal can be this highest moral kind of values embodied into one being, plus that the way how he said that the thought itself, the thing that unifies us and gods, is the thought, nothing else. Like, they don't have to have bodies, they don't have to have, the god doesn't have to have same cravings as us humans. No, only with the thought can be creation, and like how he said, shaking things. He seemed like one of those pre-Socratic philosophers I would like to talk to, like out of all of them so far that I explored. Fun guy.
Yeah, I really thought his skepticism regarding the depictions of gods was really inspiring and very, very applicable to our days. Many religious traditions, I think, are really far away from the potential in terms of ethical building and moral uplifting that can be derived from the concept of a perfect being. It's if people try to conceive of a perfect being or a higher being, at least also look to extract from this higher being lessons in behavior and ways to live one's life well. So this was so inspiring, and it was a really nice surprise for such an ancient thinker.
No, I was going to say my takeaways from Theophanes is sort of like twofold, one on the philosophy sense and one on the religious sense. And I'll go with the religious sense first. Is he comes across very much as a monotheist, where, you know, it's the one God above all, and he very much is presaging Plato with Plato's absolute. And on the more philosophy sense, where Thales had introduced because, and philosophy was wrestling with because, Theophanes kind of parses out thinking and believing both. But I see that this is the first step towards that pathos, logos, ethos sort of three level logic resolution that the Greeks for rhetoric ended up going with. And he is the one that almost, you're sitting here and he's the first one kind of putting into words the concepts that ended up becoming logos later, where it's the logic, thought, and what we share with you know, that absolute God is the idea of thought, whereas more of the ethos is our relationship to those around us, and pathos is our interior one. That logos is that connection that crosses through all of it, the truth sort of concept. Tagging on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that. I sort of presaging the ethos, pathos, or pathos, ethos, and logos, but that does make a bit of sense. And yeah, he did, like Kara said, he did say the connection between humans and gods of thinking, and like beginning to really think about thinking and not just think about the stars or think about the seasons. Also, interesting move in philosophy. So yeah, thanks. Those are important parts that didn't necessarily stood out to me. So thank you for highlighting those things.
If I may share a visual aid on this individual, since we shared from the previous three, I will click on present and show it.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, one moment. So it's there. Okay, so Xenophanes is a nice character for us to bridge to the next discussion, because although he originated from the Ionian coast, he then traveled to Italy, what is now Italy, where we will talk about our other subjects from the next session. And so here's one of his super typical quotes as related from what we've talked about. Truly the gods have not revealed to mortals all things from the beginning, but mortals by long seeking discover what is better. And so he's kind of shifting the emphasis of ownership of truth from the poets like Hesiod and Homer, that were like the authors of the equivalent of for the medievals, the Bible, but for these ancient peoples, it was the epic poems, Iliad, Odyssey, and Hesiod's Cosmogony. These were the sources of truth for many of these peoples. And he criticized, as we've mentioned, the representations, the depictions of gods as human beings, and not well-behaved human beings at that. Human-like beings that were vicious, committed adultery, that bickered often, like we've seen. We could mention in Homer, Zeus and Hera would bicker frivolously about their differences in terms of Zeus being on the side of the Trojans, and Hera and some other gods are on the side of the Achaeans, the Greeks, and how they trick each other into not paying attention to what is going on the kind of game board, the place where humans are supposedly acting like puppets of the gods. And most of the important events that happen in the Iliad, the turns of the conflict, were mediated by the gods. So the gods were kind of protecting each of the heroes. Hector was almost immune to spears and arrows and swords, while Zeus was awake. But then Hera conspired with Aphrodite and the god of sleep, Hypnos, and they arranged for a nice session of lovemaking between Hera and Zeus, where he dozed off after the session and stopped paying attention. And so they arranged for the Greeks, the Achaeans, or Danaans, they had many names, to start fighting back and start turning the tide of the conflict and start winning.
Yeah, what I like about that quote is he seems to be encouraging people not to take for granted the received wisdom that supposedly the gods revealed at the beginning of time. So looking backwards and deciding, well, it's the gods way back then gave us all the truth we'll ever need, and so we can stop asking questions and stop seeking. He says, no, mortals by long seeking can discover or do discover what's better. Like a hopeful message that by effort and study and research and problem solving and discussion, we can discover better ways of living. And I really like that.
I think he was judging the kind of reality TV sort of depiction of gods. So again, I kind of see Homer like actually being the reality TV channel and using his poetry. And it's like, oh, let me create this character. Can you tweak a little bit? Can you spice it up a little bit? What would be the most outrageous thing that would spark conflict and that entertain people? So I kind of, and he's like, well, that's not a proper reality TV for the crowd. Let's show them moral, and so, it's excellent. Actually, it's really entertaining for me.
You're hitting on exactly the point that I was going to go with, Kara, and that's the idea that, and this just hit me, the idea that a lot of the myth and a lot of the like Homer and all, it was the entertainment of the day. That was the best that they had, the most exciting stuff. And one of the aspects of that is it's written almost in this vaudeville slapstick, like Hunter S. Thompson, gonzo journalism, over the top style. And one of those things is you're able to slide in your moral lessons easily there, especially because the ordinary person can sit there and say, I'm so much better than the gods in this area. They're an example of how not to do things. And to tie it back to the quote there, one of the things that jumps out that I just love there is the idea of better. And I see the concept of the better competing with the perfect in philosophy. And in a lot of ways, I like better because I know I'll never be perfect, but I can always become better. And from a personal standpoint, I just like that sort of integration with my life better than unattainable perfect goal. Tagging on that.
I would like to compliment you, Graham, on that. I also like to stress the importance of instead of emphasizing our current position, physically or metaphysically, is also to consider and perhaps even give more attention to our vector of movement or change.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
we might have some delusions or be wrong about some things. If suppose, for example, the metaphor of a voyage across the sea. If we go straight in a line and we started with a poor bearing, we will likely not end up where we intended to. But if along the way, according to the observations of the celestial objects during daytime and nighttime, we go correcting continuously on a continuum our bearing, we are much more likely to end up where we intend to, instead of just setting the bearing on the beginning and just have faith in our pre-selected bearing. Because it would be an illusion, because along the way so many things that the environment gives us will change our bearing.
Yeah. I'm amused by something Wolf wrote. So, with our music, painting, poetry, and prose delicately, we cushion the blow of the harshness of reality and dream away the sterility of the mechanical hell of our present cosmos. Which I think is, we've been along with Xenophanes, maybe ripping a little bit the reality TV show and it being lesser than maybe some other things. But I think Wolf's trying to remind us that life can be suffering and harsh, and maybe every now and then a little bit of escape into reality. Trashy TV isn't the worst thing if it makes us feel better a little bit. There's some balance in all things, I think.
Yeah, it's important also to connect with what was going on geopolitically. Just a few decades after Thales' time. After Thales' time, most of the Ionian coast fell to the Persians. Their immediate neighbor was the Lydians, which was a nation that I've mentioned before was at a point ruled by a dynasty started by Hercules, supposedly Hercules' great-grandson. And then they were weakened by the Cimmerians that arrived from the steppes and continuously sacked their capital, Sardis. And so eventually this weakened Lydian kingdom was just a highway for Persia to arrive at the western Ionian coast. And so even without warfare, things weren't always shiny for these peoples. There was famine, disease, crops would fail, etc. And so life was, as we perceive today, it has challenges, much more so in those days with the technology that we perceive these peoples had. And so, yeah, of course, I can can sympathize with the necessity of using entertainment and arts, poetry, as a respite from the challenges and adversities that life gives us. But it must be an entertainment that uplifts the human soul or the human intellect, instead of keeping it shadowed or in a kind of a bubble of escapism, where people might be worse off because they stop paying attention to what's going on around them. And so these things need to be balanced and harmonious. It's really nice to listen to Homer or Hesiod, as I have, but when I listened to Homer, for instance, I didn't listen to him to figure out how the world works. I was trying to figure out things about human nature, and damn, Homer is really awesome at describing human nature, where, regardless of the characters being gods themselves, or even down to the human commoners that were in the story. And so if we approach these things with a good frame, a proper frame of mind, we might extract wisdom even from what we can perceive as people or individuals behaving at their worst, committing adultery, deceiving each other, etc. It's a reflection of human nature in a sense.
I'd like to also add a little bit about the whole Lydian connection there, because Lydia is a really fascinating ancient kingdom because they invented currency. You know, just a few hundred years earlier, they were coming up with the idea of coins, and you had, you know, in the ancient world, Richus Croesus, who was one of the early kings of Lydia under currency, and they had incredible wealth at times, which is why they brought the number of attacks from the outside people. As soon as you have all that money, you start becoming the target of attacks. And some of that spurring the money, leisure time, rise of philosophy, kind of all works together as a system. Tagging on that.
Yeah, that's
I
something I
also
like
have-
by Peter Adamson is he reminds us that it's kind of obvious that without enough wealth to spend time contemplating and writing and reading and discussing things, philosophy can't really get going. And so it only starts in places in the world where there is a significant concentration of wealth, so that there is a class of people who are at leisure to engage in philosophy. But it also reminds us that it's probably cynical to assume that philosophy is only ever a handmaiden of power and only ever justifying power. I guess that's taking a little bit too far, but the connection between philosophy and wealth and power historically has been quite close. And so, yeah, it's an interesting point to keep in mind as we read about these people.
So my suggestion to close up this session, since we are talking about our last guy, and it's quite a quite intense discussion, could be perhaps to end with one or some of his quotes that we share among us. So
yeah, that's good. You want to read again?
Sure, I can read one, at least one, or all of them, but we could even share the readings as well. So I'll start with the first one and see how it goes. So he said that both Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all things that are shameful and a reproach among mankind: theft, adultery, and mutual deception. So as we've mentioned. Okay, and then
Cara, do you want to do the next quote? Because
Sure.
you like him going after religion in that way.
Okay, I will read fragment 11. But if oxen and lions had hands or could draw with hands and create works of art like those of men, horses would draw pictures of gods like horses and oxen of gods like oxen, and they would make the bodies of their gods in accordance with the form that each species of itself possesses. Yeah, good point.
The last one is, we already have said it in the slide. So yeah, it's really, according to Adamson's words, this that Kara just read is kind of like the oldest sarcastic and jokingly written piece of philosophy that really drives well the point of the idolatry. The depictions of gods are really arbitrary. He even went further to say the Thracians from the north, who had fair hair, of course, they would represent the gods with fair hair as well, while the Ethiopians, having dark skin, of course, they would represent, and did so, represent the gods with darker skin. But that is all to us, it's for our interpretation. It is all surface level attributes. What really is important is what those gods stand for, that has moral value for human beings, that can give us lessons to live better lives.
It's not humans depicted in God's image. It's gods depicted in the human image, basically. That's a good point. That actually gives a good criticism to Homer's depiction of gods.
Yeah,
It's
and
like basically-
Hesiods as well.
Exactly. Yeah, we keep forgetting him, by the way.
Yeah. They were the two main guys.
I mean, yeah, but Homer is easier to pronounce. So.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah. Roughly, Hesiod showed us the family tree, which is, it's really trippy. It's very convoluted and has many surprising connections. It's nothing like a typical human tree of life, a genealogical tree. And then Homer just goes with the Marvel-esque, DC-esque representation of gods and heroes with superpowers and whatnot, and so it's all very over the top.
I
Alright,
enjoy
so
I enjoy comparing to the Hesiod to the other sorts of family trees of the gods that the Greeks came up with at different points in time. They always had something different, interesting going on. Tag and medallion.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that we continue our study group tomorrow. I believe for Europeans it would be in the same time for people because the European clocks are shifting on Sunday morning or after midnight tonight sometime. For the rest of the world, it would be an hour earlier.
I think we can adjust so that it is the same hour for each and every one of you, because this is something that only affects me. But I'm okay with adjusting so that for you guys it's the same time, if it makes sense for you. Otherwise, we'll just
let's not mention Paul. By the way.
Just have the same attitude that Europe has had about Poland since forever.
Exactly. It's only Portugal gets affected.
Yeah. I think
Shut up, Peter, introvert, who is also from Poland.
As long as nobody decides to divide Poland again.
Poland is just a piece of land that every now and then someone decides we'll have this, thanks, and maybe we'll split it up.
Again, I would by the end thank everybody for coming in the comments. I second the choice to start it to adapt to the entire world, and and Europe is just starting later. So. Okay, see you guys tomorrow. And
for episodes 4, 5, and 6. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.